Welcome to our Brexit briefing. Well, it's been another extraordinary week, and we keep having these extraordinary weeks. So I'm joined today by three experts who are going to help us understand what is going on. Peter Duncan, ex-MP, Director of Message Matters; Peter Wilding, lawyer, EU expert, the person credited with coming up with the term Brexit. And I do remember how strange it felt when Brexit disappeared from the headlines to be replaced by Brexit. Who remembers Brexit now? And finally, Andy Hyder, former head of communications for the Scottish Conservative Party. So before we dive into the detail of the politics of the last few days, just a bit about investment, because that's what we do. Of course, Chief has responsibility for people's savings. It's a big responsibility, particularly at times like this. And the question I'm regularly asked is, why are markets quite so buoyant in the face of political chaos? And I think there are several parts to that. Firstly, investment managers, investors live in the future. We're looking to what goes beyond the votes that are happening in Parliament at the moment to the future. Secondly, it's a big world out there, and we're citizens of the world. There are 7.7 billion people doing things all day, every day. This is in the world as a whole. Only 500 million of those live in Europe, and only 66 million live in the UK. It's just so important to keep all of these things in context. And globally, economies are growing, companies and people continue to innovate and do exciting things, and that's what investment is all about. So that's why markets are doing something slightly different to what you might expect from the political headlines. But the political events of this week do matter. And so perhaps, Peter Duncan, I could start with you by just saying, well, where have we got to this week? What's happened? What are the implications of all of this? And I think something that I really like to know is, what is the difference between an advisory vote and a statute that is actually implemented in law? So Peter, over to you.
It's a really, first of all, delighted to join you this morning. It's a really important week in politics. I suppose what we've learned this week is overwhelmingly more what Parliament is against rather than what it's for. We've learned that Parliament still doesn't like Mrs May's negotiated agreement with the European Union. We've learned that it absolutely doesn't like the prospect of leaving the European Union without a deal. And we've also learned yesterday that Parliament doesn't yet want to collectively seize absolute control of proceedings in the House of Commons from the government. So we've learned a lot about what Parliament doesn't want. I suppose what we're hoping at some point we're going to move into is a phase where Parliament will tell us what it does want. To reply to your particular question, David, it's a really good one, is what is the difference between these votes in Parliament and legislation? And fundamentally, it is the law of this land that Britain will leave the European Union on the 29th of March this year. Now, so at the end of the day, if nothing else happens, that's what we will do. So if that is to be changed, then the law of the land needs to be changed. And of course, similar changes need to happen at the European end too. But I think what we have learned overwhelmingly this week is that the comprehensive will of Parliament is that we don't leave without getting some sort of deal in place. And that is a very significant moment in these negotiations. Peter, do you want to say just about how Europe is seeing these changes?
Well, first of all, Europe is looking at this as an object lesson on how not to conduct international negotiations, from the premise that negotiations have ended. They repeat that context. The withdrawal agreement will not change. There will be no further addenda to that agreement. So now we're in the situation where in Brussels, they're expecting, obviously, an application to extend the Article 50 process. So two things come into place here, the legal and the political. The legal is that an extension is plainly, a technical extension is plainly available, And that availability is dependent upon a plan B being presented by the UK government. Now, if the May deal gets through, an extension will be given for technical reasons. If the May deal doesn't get through, then May must present an alternative, a plan, which may involve a general election, a second referendum, or an alternative series of proposals based upon Parliament, as Peter says, ultimately taking control by accepting the government's motion that if the deal doesn't go through, there will be a series of indicative votes on how they do next, what they do next. So that could be a shortish period of time. But the political, I think, is very interesting here, and that's where I shall sign off for this particular answer. The European Union could refuse an extension in order to create a chess endgame whereby if May's deal is voted down again and cannot be represented, the only deal that Parliament will be faced with would be no deal or revoke Article 50. So that's one extreme. The other extreme is that the European Union will offer a 21-month extension to replace the transition period, which logically is a good offer because the no vote, no veto, no voice transition period would be replaced by the UK retaining its political influence. However, that plainly is also very politically sensitive. So I think ultimately that's where we'll end up, and that's where Brussels is, Peter.
Okay, begs the question, the odds of these various permutations. This is the investment manager asking this question, because the first version, which is, this is it, guys, make your mind up time, is that a 5% chance or a 50% chance?
Why don't I'll do the daft thing and try to put predictions and odds on the various outcomes here. I think it is now a no deal scenario. Let's take this first. So no deal, in other words, coming out of the European Union and basing everything on WTO trade terms was never very likely, to be honest, and is now even less likely because of the votes of this week. The caveat to that, of course, is that it is still the law. And in order for there not to be a no-deal exit on the 29th of March, 2 weeks today, the law will have to be changed. But all the indications are that it will be changed at the UK end. And I also suspect, and I think that Peter Wilding and I are just about in agreement on this, but I also suspect that Brussels will ensure that the law at the EU end is changed as well. I don't think the EU wants to effectively be responsible for a no-deal outcome on the 29th of March. So I think a no-deal is fairly unlikely. Also in the very unlikely box, in my view, would be a second referendum. I think a second referendum has always been talked up by its proponents to a degree where people think it's closer than it actually is. As we saw last night, it's very unpopular in Parliament. It's actually not that popular in the country either, because the polling on it is quite positive if you ask people if they want a quote-unquote people's vote. But if you ask them if they want a second referendum, the polling changes quite significantly. And I actually don't think that Parliament will ever be in a position where it's going to say that a second referendum is a good idea. So I think you have a basket of more likely outcomes than that. And in that basket is May's deal or something like it. I'll come to that in a second. Also in that basket is something softer than that. Let's call that a Norway or EFTA deal for the sake of argument for the moment. And also in that basket is a general election. On May's deal, I think it's been underestimated how big a shift we had from meaningful vote 1 to meaningful vote 2. There were about 40 switchers between those two votes. Now, we are looking at meaningful vote 3 next week, probably. We might even be looking at meaningful vote 4 in the week of Brexit. It is not impossible that the strategy that May has, which is basically back my vote or you will not get Brexit, there'll be a revocation if you don't back my vote. That's what it's going to come down to. That strategy might well work. It might work with the DUP, which is critical, and it might work with sections of the ERG, and it might just be enough to get Theresa May's deal over the line. However, there's at least a 50-50 chance that won't happen, and then you get to the other two outcomes I discussed, one of which is general election, the other of which is a softer Norway EFTA-style Brexit. Now, if you look at the composition of Westminster, it was always likely that if there was going to be a majority for something, it was going to be a something in the middle type of option. It wasn't going to be for WTO exit, and it wasn't going to be for staying in. It was always going to be in the Parliament for something in the middle. And I think that the so-called Norway option always takes a few seemingly mortal blows from time to time, but it never quite dies. And it is still just about alive in Parliament. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if the May deal pivots towards a Norway option if it seems likely that that constituency of softer Brexiteers might give her majority in a more likely scenario than the harder Brexiteers. And finally, the general election that I mentioned. If we get to the point where next week or over the next 2 weeks, we have a series of indicative votes on things like Norway, on things like a second referendum on revocation, and another meaningful vote on Theresa May's deal, and none of those votes command a majority, which is entirely possible. It's very possible that there's not a single outcome that the Commons can find a majority on. If that's the case, there's very little road then. It's then a long extension and very probably a general election with a new Tory leader.
And it's certainly, I mean, having spoken to quite a lot of members of Parliament, particularly on the Conservative benches at Westminster over the last couple of days, there's no doubt in my mind that two things are working in the Prime Minister's favour at the moment as far as her deal is concerned. I mean, she's had a shocker of a week in many ways. She's had a very difficult number of months, obviously. But I think as far as her deal is concerned, two things are particularly significant as far as increasing prospects for it in coming days, potentially next week. Number one is some of the Andy referred to the people who had changed their minds between the first vote and the second vote. Now, whilst there were only 40 of them, they did include some quite significant people. They included, for example, David Davis, the former Brexit secretary who resigned because he didn't like the way negotiations were going, is now voting for the Prime Minister's deal. And secondly, I think, and Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee, very influential backbencher, these are people who may well bring other people with them in subsequent votes. The second factor, I think, is this fear of the long extension. And however much the commentariat has said that Theresa May's strategy was talking down the as it was, the reality is we are now in the last couple of weeks where this is becoming really tightly focused for those people in the Conservative Party particularly, but also on Leave constituencies on Labour benches who absolutely feel the imperative of delivering some of the Brexit. And I think both of those things over this weekend are going to be quite significant themes. And by next Tuesday, it's possible the Prime Minister may have made significant progress towards getting her deal approved.
I just want to pick up the people comments that are coming out, because I think people are driving this. That's how everything works, done by people, not machines. How are these people within Parliament, and then in terms of how the UK works with the EU in the future, how are these people going to get on with each other after all this gets done? I mean, are they going to like each other enough to work together, or are they going to hate each other forever? How do you feel that's going to play out, both within Parliament in the UK and our relationship with the EU in the future?
Why don't I talk about some of the personal relationships in Parliament? And then maybe, I think, Peter, maybe if you may just talk about the relationship between the negotiating teams, perhaps UK and the EU and that relationship. And then Andy perhaps might reflect on the state of the political parties at Westminster and how they might fracture. As far as personal relationships are concerned, I have never known times like where people who have been friends and colleagues on the same side of the house or on different sides of the house, who have been so unable to speak to each other in social situations, who have been so unable to entertain dialogues with people with whom they disagree. It's a very corrosive period as far as parliamentary relationships are concerned, and there's quite a lot of animosity being built up that will be very difficult to unwind. And some of that has been compounded in the last week in some of the extraordinary breakdowns in government collective responsibility. So colleagues in government who have failed to back government policy are now being talked about very critically and very openly in backbench situations. I mean, the situation yesterday, which was some sort of new record, where the Brexit opened a debate proposing the government's motion, and then at the end of that debate, then voted against it, is a remarkable situation to observe. Peter, what about the European angle?
Well, I mean, the top line comment here is that the European Union will deal with the team that is put in front of it by the UK government. Have relationships worsened? Of course they have. But there's more pity rather than anger at the demonstration of how the UK government has essentially failed to prepare a coherent strategy, have a serious objective, or three, have capable tactics in order to deliver that strategy. So the European Union has bigger fish to fry than Brexit. So I'm not too concerned about personal relationships in that respect. But, and this is a big but, and this is just jumping on what Andy said, I agree the second referendum in its own right has limited appeal at the moment. But a second referendum could be a contingency attached to a Labour vote for the deal, either on Tuesday or more likely, should we move to MV4, which I doubt anyway. So I don't see the second referendum in and of itself an answer, but it could be contingent, as in the Kyle Wilson Labour Party amendment, that will back your deal as long as it's put to the public. So that may well return if May's deal is shot down. A little bit about the comment about relationships with regard to what happens next. If I was the ERG, recognizing the situation I would be in, I would support the deal because it gets Brexit done, but I would ask for a very heavy price, frankly, and that price would be May appointing ERGers to the critical phase vis-à-vis the European Union, which is the negotiation of the New Deal under the political declaration. I mean, that we are at the end of the beginning here. The next stage is where the serious battle emerges. And I can see a situation twofold, just to conclude my remarks. One, we had a series of indicative votes, as Andy said, where we end up with May pivoting to an EEA option. But frankly, if she does, you have to query whether parts or all of the ERG then hold the Tory party whip. Because if the political declaration is changed to limit the future manoeuvre only to a Norway option, then that crucifies the ERG's rationale for agreeing to May's deal. That's the point I would like to make, that the ERG could see the benefit of approving May's deal, but only if they take control of the negotiations that follow it. Otherwise, what's the point in approving May's deal? And secondly, there's no chance of a pivot to an EEA option as far as May is concerned, because her chief priority is to keep the Tory party together. And that Norway deal is deeply offensive to the principles, such as they are, held by the ERG. So that's the worry when we get UK and EU negotiation beginning, that it's not good faith.
I want to pick up this point about the next stage of the negotiations or the discussions, because I was talking to some Swiss people about this, and they voted not to be part of the EU some 25 years ago, by a very narrow majority, very narrow. And they've been in constant negotiation with the EU ever since, deal by deal, sector by sector, compromise by compromise. It is simply part of the political process and the economy of Switzerland. Do you foresee this being something similar for the UK as we look to the future?
Is the Swiss position comes from a different political dynamic. It's much easier for them as a nation that has essentially throughout its history since the Napoleonic Wars been a neutral and a non-participant in defence and security arrangements. So they can accept the piecemeal negotiations, but the United Kingdom clearly is in a very different geopolitical position than Switzerland, and I'm not sure what the appetite would be for governments in the future to be in that step-by-step approach. And secondly, it's really worth bearing in mind, as an answer to your question, that the European Union wants to eliminate the polity of the Swiss exception. It doesn't like it. It didn't expect it when the Swiss voted not to join the EEA. And it's exceptionally hostile to this, as you saw in the response to the referendum on immigration several years ago. So it's theoretically certainly in order, but I don't think geopolitically or politically it's where the UK or the EU wants to be.
Let me just come in on that as well, because I think what's critical to how things look during any transition period that we have, and how the negotiate. I mean, Peter Welding correctly said earlier, this is the easy bit here. This is the mechanism of how you pull out. This isn't the actual difficult trade deal. What will be critical to that, to return to a point I mentioned earlier, is what the Westminster party structure looks like. And at the moment, although publicly we have two primary parties, actually we already have four parties in Westminster. We have a centre-right, relatively softish Conservative Party. That's the party of Cameron and Osborne and May, and Jeremy Hunt, and people like that in the cabinet. And then you have also on the right the ERG, which has its own leader, its own whip, and is as close to operating as a different party as you can get. On the left, we have a Socialist Party and a Social Democrat Party. The Socialist Party is Jeremy Corbyn's front bench. The Social Democrat Party is a huge portion of Jeremy Corbyn's backbench, plus the 8 or 9 MPs who have already left it and joined the independent group. So the way that plays out will be very important to how Britain conducts its negotiation post-Brexit during the transition period. It's at the moment very difficult to say who's actually going to be in charge. It's difficult to say what party's going to be in charge. It's difficult to say whether or not either of the two existing parties will be in charge. British politics doesn't have a rich history of massive change, largely because of the first-past-the-post electoral system. But this is the sort of issue that can potentially promote a big bang in British politics, where at the next general election, or possibly the one after, the parties you're voting for might look and sound and be called something completely different to what you see at the moment. So this is as close as we've come in, I guess, almost 100 years to the sort of substantial party structure change that we might see over the next 2 to 3 years, and that will critically inform the look and feel that the trade deal with the EU has.
Okay, I think I'm watching the clock. Time is marching on. I have a few sort of summing up comments to make, if I may, but anyone want to say anything more before I do that?
I was just going to make one point, David, which I think it will be interesting for people to reflect on. And I think there's some significance to market movements and stuff as well. And it's a legitimate question to ask, how long is the Prime Minister going to go on for? I mean, anyone who's seen her this week will have seen a Prime Minister who's, emotionally, arguably exhausted. I mean, her resilience is exceptional, but there will be, there's a very fine line between resilience and pity, and I think she wants to be very careful of where she is on that continuum. There's a very long list of people who want to be leader of the Conservative Party after we leave the European Union, and there is a very short list of people who are interested in this very job before we leave the European Union. So my judgment at the moment is, however difficult this week, potentially next week is, the Prime Minister is safe until such time as there is either we leave the European Union, or alternatively a very long extension is put in place, in which case her position becomes very precarious indeed from the backbench of the Conservative Party perspective.
I'm in no doubt, to pick up Andy's comment and all of your comments, that historians will make careers out of what is going on at the moment, and they'll be reflecting on this in the decades to come. These are extraordinary times. I think it is important that we understand the mechanics of what's going on a day-by-day basis. And without fear of contradiction, I'm sure that there will be more to talk about in the coming days and weeks because it keeps changing. And that's fascinating. I think as far as investment is concerned and investment markets, just to pick up what I said earlier, people are continuing to make decisions based on available information. Companies are making decisions based upon available information and judgments about the future. And that is ever thus. That is how investment markets operate. That's how business operates. And I think that goes some way to explaining the lack of reaction to the headlines by investors generally. Clearly, if some of the more extreme outcomes come along, there'll be work to be done. But at the moment, the markets, which essentially are a very effective poll on opinion, are reflecting the fact that something will get done over the next weeks or whatever, so that we will have greater certainty. And then, as usual, the removal of uncertainty actually then leads to a recovery, whatever the outcome is. And that, I think, is what we're seeing in markets. That's why the pound has been quite strong, why the FTSE 100 has been going up. These are all connected. It doesn't mean it's set in stone, but that's where we are at the moment. So I think it leaves for me to thank you, the experts, for illuminating what is going on. It's what we need to know. To thank all of you who are watching. And I think to be continued. Thank you. I think to be continued. Thank you.